Let's get the light up a little bit in the house so I can see who's here without constantly saluting you. You may have noticed things are speeding up, speed of interaction, innovation. Cities like Milan move very quickly. Half of the world lives in cities now, moving very quickly. The expectation is by mid-century, 80% of the world will live in cities, moving very quickly. Technology, I live in California. Technology is speeding up. Moore's law keeps accelerating the pace of certain technologies. Biotechnology in this century will probably speed up the way information technology did in the last century, the 20th century. It still is. The idea of the Long Now Foundation is to match that as we speed up, because that's all good. I think going faster is outstanding. For one thing, I'm 72 years old. You get to have a whole lot more stuff happen in one lifetime than used to be the case. But most of the ways that we had for thinking about long-term stuff, tradition, maybe religion, language, things like that, are still getting used to how to deal with this speeded up everything. And the idea of the Long Now Foundation, and I should point at a book translated by David here, that is Il Lungo Presente. The idea of the Long Now started in California, the right place for it, to bear in mind, as we do all this speeding up, the frame of reference of the very long periods of time that civilization has been going. So civilization, what, 10,000 years? And figure we're in the middle of the story. It started 10,000 years ago with the first towns, and then agriculture, and domesticated, and towns that got bigger, and things have been speeding up. Figure we're in the middle of a story that goes out another 10,000 years, and that's 20,000 years, and that's the long now. The short now is this week, next week, last week. The long now is 20,000 years. With the idea that we don't know yet how to think as a civilization. We know how to think as a country. We know how to think as a city. Cities, I notice, are much more adaptive than countries. But we don't know really how to think of ourselves as one civilization, as one set of earthlings living on this planet. We're all connected now. That's another thing that speeds us up. The internet, cell phones. What would happen? It's just a question. If we got really used to thinking of the last 10,000 years just like we think about last week, and the next 10,000 years just the way we think about next week. Because next week we sort of have plans, we have an idea of what we're going to do, we have a sense of responsibility to affect our behavior over that period of time. And once we get to be grandparents, we start to include not only our children, but our grandchildren. It starts to stretch it out a little bit. But what if you can move it way beyond grandchildren and grandparents in both directions? So the term the long now came from Brian Eno, who's a good friend and a member of the board of the Long Now Foundation. He was in the city, he was in New York City, and discovered that people he was visiting in New York were only interested in basically the room they were in. They were responsible for the room they were in, maybe their apartment or their flat. But what happened in the neighborhood outside their door, they didn't care. So they lived in a tiny here, and being good New Yorkers, living in a hot New York minute, and a tiny now. So Brian thought about, well, what if people lived in a bigger here, and I guess the biggest here so far is the planet, and a long now. And eventually we decided that civilization was the right size to think about now, for now. There's other people who are geologists who say that's way too short. Astronomers say that's way too short. 10,000 years, that's nothing. The precession of the equinoxes as the North Pole rotates against the starry sky, that's a period of 26,000 years. One of the people that we worked with is a computer designer named Danny Hillis. Talk about interaction and innovation. He was the developer of massive parallel processing, which is the fastest form of computers. And this was back in 1992, 1993. And he noticed that all through his lifetime, he was 30-something then, people had been talking about the future as the year 2000. And it became a kind of a membrane in people's consciousness that the future is the year 2000. And then 5 years later, the future is still the year 2000. So as Danny said, the future has been getting shorter by 1 year per year for my entire life. This is not a good trend. And he's an engineer. Try to think about what would be a device, a work of art, that would help people think through that membrane of the year 2000, think into the longer time frame. And he came up with the idea of a 10,000-year clock that, as he said, would tick once a year, long once a century, and every 1,000 years the cuckoo would come out. And that was kind of a nice idea. A few people kind of snickered at it, a few other people thought he was crazy, or having a midlife crisis or something. But he and I got together with Brian Eno and with others and set in motion the ambition to build a 10,000-year clock, a clock that would keep time all by itself for 10 millennia. Such a thing has never been done. You can go to old monuments, what are the 2,500 years ago or so for the, 3,500 for the pyramids, but they don't tick. They don't do anything. They just sit there. We wanted to have a work of art that would actually do something for that long period of time. And we got involved in other projects. Next thing we knew, we were trying to deal with the digital dark ages we're in right now, is that basically everything we do is digital, and everything that is stored as digital lasts about 10 years, and then it's evaporated, which is not such a good idea for civilization to lose its own memory all the time. Amnesia is not a good, healthy situation for civilization. So we thought, well, what is the way? The great thing about digital stuff is you can compress it very small into a thumb drive, into a hard drive. Could we compress non-digital information that small? And so we came up with the idea. It turns out you can, with certain forms of technology, concentrate 30,000 pages visually, so you could read it with a microscope on a disk about that big. We thought, well, if we can do that, let's do that. Prove that you can actually store information. And let's call it, what's worth storing for thousands of years in a really accessible form? And our inspiration was the Rosetta Stone, where you remember there were basically 3 languages all saying the same thing on a stone in Italy, or sorry, in Egypt. And that allowed us to finally understand what the Egyptians were saying to each other with hieroglyphics. So we thought, okay, how about a Rosetta disk that has all the languages in the world, translating the same things with a lot of information that linguists care about, put it into a disk of 30,000 pages that can be read by a microscope. No, an 18th century microscope would be just fine. So we did that. And lo and behold, one of the peculiar things is that nobody had ever tried to collect all the languages in the world in one place before. So what we were inspired by with that is that it turns out when you try to collect everything, one, you can do it now in a way that did not used to be possible. And two, you change the way people think about things when you collect it like that. In a sense, the internet is our Rosetta disk these days. Things like Wikipedia is our living Rosetta disk. But we know that it could disappear any time. If the internet goes down, civilization is in danger. Most people, even when they saw the reality of the Rosetta disk that we made, thought, well, this is a nice story, this 10,000-year clock story. It's a metaphor. It's a really interesting metaphor. It's kind of a science fiction story. And Danny is an engineer, and we hired other people with industrial design and engineering backgrounds. And they don't want a story, they want a clock that ticks and bongs and has a cuckoo that comes out. So, first off, we built a prototype. It stands about yay high. That is a working prototype of a 10,000-year clock that is in the Science Museum in London. Which direction is London from here? Where's London? That way. Okay, good. I pointed that way, which shows how out of sync I am. London has the first prototype of the clock. It cost about $1 million. A friend had put up. And it worked. But it's just a model, in a sense. It's like a dollhouse model, because the idea, as it developed, is that we wanted to have a 10,000-year clock that probably was not on the surface, because things on the surface go very quickly. But underground, stuff lasts very well. But the long view, 10,000 years, you want a place that's underground and has a good long view, a good long perspective. So that means a mountain. And we realized that we wanted to build a 10,000-year clock inside a mountain somewhere. And the ideal mountains in terms of lasting a long time and not being turned into something else is out in the desert. So we first wound up with a mountain in the emptiest part of North America, which is in Nevada. It's mostly desert, mountain. And then, so we're working toward building a clock there, right next to a national park. And then a friend who bought some property, very large amount of property in west Texas, right between Texas and right next to Mexico, very far south, had a mountain range. And he is arranging for us to build a 10,000-year clock in that mountain range. Last week, we did the first blast of the tunnel that will go into the 400-foot high shaft in which the 10,000-year clock will be built. And we're building the damn thing. There will really be a 10,000-year clock within the next couple of years. We're building pieces of the clock that go into the mountain. Now there's a thing called a Geneva wheel that goes from about here to about here. That's one gear. Oh, 400 feet. And then Brian Eno has designed a chime system. He's basically invented a new kind of bell. And he, working with Danny Hillis, came up with the idea of a 10-bell set of chimes. And it turns out if you do a different combination of 10 bells every day, you can have, they will not repeat for 10,000 years. So every day this clock will play a set of bells, ding dong, ding dong, ding ding dong, which will be different the next day for 10,000 years. And then it cycles. So